Sometimes fate arrives on horseback in the middle of a thunderstorm, and sometimes it comes wearing a torn wedding dress and bare feet bleeding on the dusty ground. Jake Morrison had been running cattle on the Dusty Creek Range for 10 hard years, and he'd learned to read the signs that most folks missed. The way the wind shifted before a storm, the restless movement of his herd when predators prowled nearby, the particular quality of silence that meant trouble was riding his way. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But nothing in his decade of ranching had prepared him for what he'd find stumbling down the main road to town on that sweltering August evening in 1882. The woman appeared like a mirage through the heat waves rising from the sun-baked earth, her white dress catching the last rays of sunlight as she swayed dangerously with each unsteady step. At first, Jake thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. What would a lady in wedding finery be doing alone on this desolate stretch of Texas range, miles from the nearest town and farther still from anything resembling civilization? But as his horse Thunder carried him closer, the reality of her situation became unmistakably clear. She was real, she was in trouble, and she was about to collapse from exhaustion and exposure. The wedding dress told its own story of violence and desperation. What had once been an elegant gown of ivory silk and delicate lace was now torn and stained, the elaborate bustle dragging in the dust behind her like a broken wing. The bodice hung in tatters, held together by her trembling hands and sheer determination. Her dark hair, which must have been arranged in careful ringlets for the ceremony, now hung loose around her shoulders in tangled waves. But it was her feet that made Jake's jaw clench with anger. They were bare and bloodied, telling the tale of a desperate flight across miles of unforgiving terrain. She looked up at the sound of approaching hoofbeats, and Jake found himself staring into the most striking pair of green eyes he'd ever seen. They were wide with fear and exhaustion, but beneath that terror burned a fierce determination that spoke of inner strength. This wasn't some fragile flower wilting under adversity. This was a woman who'd made a choice, paid a price for it, and was prepared to keep paying whatever it cost to stay free. When she saw him approaching, her first instinct was to run. She gathered what remained of her skirts and tried to flee, but her battered feet betrayed her. She stumbled and would have fallen face first into the rocky ground if Jake hadn't dismounted in one fluid motion and caught her in his massive arms. The impact of her slight frame against his chest sent an unexpected jolt through him, something he hadn't felt in the 10 years since he'd sworn off complications and focused solely on building his ranch. The woman in his arms couldn't have weighed more than 110 pounds soaking wet, and she was trembling like a frightened colt. But when she looked up at him, there was no submission in her gaze, only wariness and the kind of desperate courage that came from having nothing left to lose. She was beautiful, that much was undeniable, but it was a beauty marked by recent trauma. A purple bruise darkened her left cheek, and there were finger-shaped marks on her pale throat that made Jake's vision blur with rage. Jake Morrison stood 6 feet 8 inches in his boots and had shoulders broad enough to block out the sun, but he'd learned long ago that his size could be intimidating to folks who didn't know him. He gentled his voice the way he would when approaching a spooked horse, keeping his movements slow and deliberate as he steadied the woman on her feet. Her green eyes darted between his face and the horizon behind him, clearly calculating whether she had the strength to run again if this giant cowboy proved to be another threat. "Easy there, miss," Jake said, his deep voice carrying the slight drawl he'd picked up during his years in Texas. "I'm not going to hurt you. Looks like you've had enough of that for one day." He noticed how she flinched at his words, and he realized someone had hurt her badly and recently. The protective instinct that had been dormant for years suddenly roared to life in his chest. "Please," she whispered, and her voice carried the refined accent of Eastern education, completely at odds with her current bedraggled state. "I need to get to town. I have to keep moving." Her legs chose that moment to give out entirely, and once again Jake found himself supporting her full weight as she sagged against him. "Town's still 8 miles south, and you're in no condition to walk another step," Jake observed, noting the way she swayed even with his support. "When's the last time you had water or food?" The blank look she gave him suggested she couldn't remember, which explained why she was on the verge of collapse despite her obvious determination. Jake made a decision that would change both their lives, though neither of them knew it at the time. "I've got a ranch about 2 miles north of here. Good water, food, and a place for you to rest until you're strong enough to travel safely." He saw the immediate suspicion that flared in her eyes and added quickly, "I've got a housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, who looks after the place. You'll be properly chaperoned and safe." It was a lie about the housekeeper. Mrs. Chen had left 3 months ago to care for her ailing sister in San Antonio, and Jake had been managing the household himself since then. But something about this woman's situation told him that propriety was the least of her concerns right now, and if a small deception would make her feel safer accepting his help, he was prepared to deal with the consequences later. The woman studied his face for a long moment, and Jake had the unsettling feeling that she was seeing far more than he was comfortable revealing. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. "I don't have any money to pay you for your kindness," she said, and the admission clearly cost her pride. "Didn't ask for any," Jake replied, already calculating how best to get her to the ranch without causing her additional pain. Her feet were in no condition for walking, and Thunder, while gentle for a horse his size, wasn't used to carrying double. "What's your name, miss, so I know what to call you?" For a moment he thought she wasn't going to answer. Her eyes took on a distant look, as if she was saying goodbye to something. "Emma," she said finally. "Emma Wells." Again Jake had the impression that she was choosing her words carefully, possibly choosing her identity carefully as well. "Well, Miss Wells, I'm Jake Morrison, and this is my spread you've wandered onto. Let's get you somewhere safe before you fall over completely." Without waiting for her permission, he scooped her up in his arms, noting how she stiffened initially before exhaustion forced her to accept his help. She weighed almost nothing, and he could feel the rapid flutter of her heartbeat against his chest as he settled her sideways in his saddle before swinging up behind her. The ride to the ranch house took 20 minutes, during which Emma Wells drifted in and out of consciousness. Jake found himself hyper-aware of every detail about the woman in his arms. The way her dark hair smelled faintly of orange blossoms despite her ordeal, the soft sound of her breathing, the way she instinctively trusted him enough to let herself rest against his chest even while unconscious. It had been a long time since he'd held a woman, and longer still since he'd felt the protective tenderness that was stirring in his chest. The Morrison ranch house came into view as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Jake had built it himself over the course of 3 years using local stone for the foundation and walls, with a wide wraparound porch that caught the evening breeze. It wasn't elegant by city standards, but it was solid and comfortable, designed to withstand Texas weather and provide a peaceful refuge from the
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Demands of ranch life. The sight of it always filled him with quiet pride, but today he found himself seeing it through Emma's eyes and wondering what a refined Eastern lady would think of his rough-hewn home. Emma stirred as Thunder's hooves clattered on the wooden bridge that crossed Dusty Creek, the natural water source that had determined the location of both the ranch and the town that shared its name. Her green eyes opened and focused on the house ahead, and Jake saw her take in the details with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating her surroundings for safety. "It's beautiful," she said softly, and the genuine appreciation in her voice warmed something in Jake's chest that had been cold for far too long. "You built all this yourself?" There was wonder in her question, as if the idea of creating something substantial with your own hands was foreign to her experience. "Took me 3 years to get it right," Jake admitted as he guided Thunder toward the front porch. "Had to learn carpentry and masonry as I went, made plenty of mistakes along the way. But it's solid now, and it's mine." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, the satisfaction of a man who'd built something lasting from nothing. He dismounted and reached up to help Emma down, noting how she tried to hide her wince when her feet touched the ground. The porch steps might as well have been mountains for someone in her condition, but she gathered the tattered remains of her dignity, and attempted to climb them on her own. Jake watched her struggle for exactly 3 seconds before his patience ran out. "That's enough of that foolishness," he declared, sweeping her up in his arms once again despite her startled protest. "You can be independent and stubborn tomorrow when you're not swaying on your feet." He carried her up the steps and through the front door, noting how she went very still in his arms as they crossed the threshold. The interior of the ranch house reflected Jake's practical nature and bachelor lifestyle. The main room served as both parlor and dining area, furnished with solid wooden furniture he'd crafted himself during the long winter evenings. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, while windows on the opposite side provided views of the ranch's rolling pastures. Everything was clean and well maintained, but it clearly lacked a woman's touch in its stark functionality. Jake carried Emma to the guest bedroom, a comfortable space he'd originally intended for his sister before she'd married and moved to California. The room contained a large bed with a hand-carved wooden frame, a matching dresser and washstand, and windows that faced east to catch the morning sun. He set Emma gently on the bed, and immediately busied himself lighting the oil lamp on the bedside table, suddenly aware of how intimate the situation had become. "I'll get you some water and food," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended, "and I'll see what I can find for those feet of yours." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Miss Wells, whatever brought you to my range in that condition, whatever you're running from, you're safe here. I give you my word on that." Emma looked up at him with those remarkable green eyes, and for a moment Jake felt like she was seeing straight through to his soul. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why are you helping me? You don't know anything about me, or what kind of trouble I might bring to your door." It was a fair question, and one Jake wasn't entirely sure how to answer. He'd built his life around solitude and self-reliance, avoiding complications, and especially avoiding anything to do with women, and the heartache they could bring. But something about Emma Wells had gotten past all his carefully constructed defenses from the moment he'd seen her stumbling down that dusty road. "Maybe because 10 years ago I needed help and didn't get it," he said finally. "Maybe because no woman should have to face whatever you're facing alone." He met her gaze steadily. "Or maybe because it's just the right thing to do. Does the reason matter?" Emma studied his face for a long moment, then shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered, "the reason doesn't matter. Thank you, Mr. Morrison, I won't forget your kindness." Jake nodded and left her alone to rest, but as he made his way to the kitchen to prepare food and gather medical supplies, he couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet, orderly life had just been turned completely upside down. Emma Wells was hiding something, that much was clear, and whatever had happened to put those bruises on her face and send her fleeing across the Texas range in a torn wedding dress was probably going to follow her here eventually. The smart thing would be to help her recover her strength, give her some traveling money, and send her on her way before whatever trouble she was carrying could reach his ranch. Jake had worked too hard building his life here to risk it for a woman he'd known for less than an hour, no matter how those green eyes affected him or how right she'd felt in his arms. But as he pumped water into a basin and gathered clean cloth for bandages, Jake Morrison was already admitting to himself that smart had nothing to do with it. Something about Emma Wells had gotten under his skin in a way that no woman had managed in 10 years, and despite every logical reason to keep his distance, he found himself hoping she'd stay long enough for him to figure out what that something was. Outside, thunder whinnied softly in the gathering darkness, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. The night sounds of the Texas range continued their eternal rhythm, but inside the ranch house, everything had changed. Jake Morrison's carefully ordered world now included a mysterious woman with secrets in her eyes, and trouble on her trail, and whether he was ready or not, his life would never be the same. Jake Morrison had learned to read the land the way other men read books, and the Texas hill country around Dusty Creek had taught him lessons that no Eastern university could have provided. He'd arrived here 10 years ago with nothing but the clothes on his back, a war-weary horse named Thunder, and a handful of silver dollars that represented everything he had left in the world. The sight of this particular stretch of range, with its rolling grassland bisected by a clear running creek and backed by red rock formations that glowed like fire in the sunset, had spoken to something deep in his soul. The land had been available because the previous owner, a carpetbagger from Chicago, had tried to run cattle without understanding the first thing about Texas weather or longhorn temperament. After losing half his herd to a combination of drought, predators, and his own ignorance, he'd been eager to sell to anyone with cash money and the gumption to try again. Jake had spent his first winter living in a dugout carved into the creek bank, slowly accumulating the materials and knowledge he'd need to build something permanent. Those early years had been brutal in ways that still visited him in dreams, learning to handle cattle that were half wild and completely ornery, dealing with rustlers who thought a lone man would be easy prey, surviving blue northers that could freeze a man solid in his saddle if he was caught unprepared. He'd made mistakes that cost him money he couldn't afford to lose, trusted the wrong people, and more than once found himself wondering if he'd been a fool to think he could build a life in this unforgiving country. But Jake Morrison was nothing if not stubborn, a trait he'd inherited from his Irish grandmother along with his unusual height, and the dark hair that was now streaked with premature gray from years of sun and hard living. He'd learned from each mistake, adapted to each challenge, and slowly built his operation from a ragtag collection of borrowed cattle and salvaged equipment into one of the most successful ranches in the county. The war had changed him in ways that went deeper than the visible scars on his body. Jake had enlisted as a green boy of 18, full of romantic notions about honor and glory, and returned 4 years later as a man who'd seen too much death and destruction to ever again believe in simple answers. The cavalry unit he'd served with had been present at some of the bloodiest battles of the conflict, and Jake had learned skills that had nothing to do with ranching but everything to do with staying alive when other men wanted to kill you. More than the physical skills though, the war had taught him to trust his instincts about people. He'd served alongside men who would die for their comrades, and others who would sell them out for a bottle of whiskey and safe passage behind enemy lines. He'd learned to read the signs that separated the genuinely dangerous from the merely threatening, the trustworthy from the treacherous, the strong from those who only appeared so on the surface. Those instincts were telling him now that Emma Wells was far more than she appeared to be. Her hands, when he'd helped her from the saddle, had been soft but not helpless. She'd moved with the unconscious grace of someone accustomed to physical activity, despite her refined speech and mannerisms. Most telling of all, she'd assessed his ranch house and its defensive capabilities with the quick, practical eye of someone who'd learned to evaluate her surroundings for safety rather than comfort. The kitchen where Jake now worked preparing a meal for his unexpected guest reflected 10 years of bachelor practicality. The cast-iron stove he'd hauled from San Antonio by wagon, the oak table he'd built from timber cut on his own land, the shelves lined with preserved foods and basic cooking implements. Everything was functional and well-maintained, but it lacked the warmth and character that a woman's presence might have provided. Jake had never married, though it hadn't been for lack of opportunity or inclination. There had been women over the years, most notably Sarah Beth Carson, the banker's daughter in town, who'd made her interest in becoming Mrs. Morrison abundantly clear. She was pretty enough, well-educated, and would have brought a substantial dowry to the marriage, but every time Jake had considered proposing, something had held him back. Perhaps it was the memory of his parents' marriage, which had been based on genuine affection and mutual respect rather than financial advantage. His father had been a cavalry officer stationed in Texas during the Mexican War, and his mother had been the daughter of a local rancher who'd seen something in the young soldier beyond his uniform and prospects. They'd built their life together from shared dreams and hard work, and their love had been evident to anyone who spent 5 minutes in their company. Jake had wanted that kind of partnership for himself, but he'd never found a woman who stirred those feelings in him. Sarah Beth was pleasant company, and would have made a dutiful wife, but she didn't make his pulse quicken, or his thoughts scatter the way Emma Wells had managed to do in the space of an hour. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying for a man who'd built his life around careful planning and emotional control. As he prepared a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and preserved peaches, Jake found his thoughts returning again and again to the woman resting in his guest room. Everything about her situation raised questions that she clearly wasn't ready to answer. The wedding dress suggested she'd been a bride, but where was the groom? The bruises on her face and throat indicated violence, but who would dare strike a woman on what should have been the happiest day of her life? Most puzzling of all was her presence on his remote stretch of range. The nearest town that might host a wedding was Dusty Creek itself, and Jake knew everyone within 50 miles well enough to be certain that no wedding had been planned there. San Antonio was the closest city large enough to support the kind of elaborate ceremony that dress suggested, but that was over 100 miles southeast. For Emma to have traveled that distance on foot would have required days, not hours, and she clearly hadn't been walking that long. The mystery deepened when Jake considered her physical condition. Despite her exhaustion and the obvious trauma she'd suffered, Emma Wells didn't have the appearance of someone who'd been living rough for an extended period. Her hair, beneath the dust and tangles, showed signs of recent professional styling. Her nails, though broken and dirty now, had been carefully manicured. Even the wedding dress, torn and stained as it was, represented a level of luxury that suggested significant wealth. Jake had encountered enough desperate people over the years to recognize the signs of someone fleeing serious trouble. During the chaotic years following the war, His ranch had become an unofficial stop on various underground railways, helping former slaves reach freedom in the North and Confederate deserters escape military justice. He'd learned not to ask too many questions about people's backgrounds, focusing instead on providing temporary sanctuary while they gathered strength for whatever came next. But Emma Wells was different from those previous refugees in ways that made Jake's protective instincts flare to dangerous levels. The others had been running from abstract threats, poverty, persecution, legal troubles that might catch up with them eventually. Emma was running from something immediate and personal, something that had marked her body and put that particular combination of fear and determination in her remarkable green eyes. The sound of movement from the guest room interrupted Jake's brooding. He quickly assembled a tray with the simple meal he'd prepared, added a pot of coffee and clean bandages for her injured feet, and made his way back down the hallway. He knocked softly on the doorframe, not wanting to startle her if she'd managed to fall asleep. "Miss Wells, I've brought you some food and coffee." Her voice when it came sounded stronger than it had earlier, though still tinged with exhaustion. "Please come in, Mr. Morrison, I'm awake." Jake entered to find Emma sitting on the edge of the bed, having attempted to repair the worst damage to her wedding dress using pins from her hair. The result was modest if not entirely successful, and she'd managed to braid her dark hair back from her face in a way that emphasized the delicate bone structure that no amount of bruising could disguise. "You didn't need to go to all this trouble," she said as Jake set the tray on the bedside table. "I'm grateful for anything you can spare." Despite her words, Jake noticed how her eyes lingered on the food with the intensity of someone who hadn't eaten in far too long. "Trouble would be letting a guest go hungry under my roof," Jake replied, settling into the wooden chair beside the bed. "My mother would tan my hide even from the grave if she thought I'd forgotten my manners." The mention of his mother seemed to relax Emma slightly, perhaps reassuring her that he'd been raised to respect women rather than exploit them. As she ate with the careful restraint of someone trying not to appear too desperate, Jake found himself studying her face in the lamplight. The bruises were even more pronounced now, dark purple marks that would take weeks to fade completely, but beneath the evidence of recent trauma, he could see the intelligence and strength that had carried her this far. Her green eyes missed nothing, cataloging details about the room and its occupant with the same thoroughness he'd noticed earlier. "This is delicious," Emma said after several minutes of focused eating. "Did you prepare it yourself?" There was genuine surprise in her voice, as if the idea of a man cooking was foreign to her experience. "Been taking care of myself for 10 years now," Jake replied. "A man learns to cook or he starves, and I'm too stubborn to starve." His attempt at humor earned him a small smile, the first he'd seen from her, and the transformation it wrought in her face was remarkable. Even bruised and exhausted, Emma Wells was beautiful in a way that made Jake's chest tighten with emotions he'd thought he'd successfully buried. "Tell me about your ranch," Emma said, clearly seeking a safe topic of conversation. "How did you come to settle in this particular place?" The question gave Jake an opportunity to share the safer parts of his story while avoiding the more painful details of what had driven him to Texas in the first place. He told her about his first sight of the land, the back-breaking work of building the ranch from nothing, the satisfaction of watching his herd grow from a few dozen scraggly longhorns to the several hundred head that now grazed his range. He described the seasonal rhythms of ranch life, the spring roundups and fall drives to market, the constant battle against weather, predators, and the dozens of other challenges that could destroy a year's work in a matter of days. As he talked, Jake noticed how Emma's eyes softened with what appeared to be genuine interest. She asked intelligent questions about cattle breeding, water rights, and the economics of the beef trade that revealed a mind capable of grasping complex concepts quickly. It became increasingly clear that despite her refined appearance, Emma Wells possessed a practical intelligence that had been trained on more than just the social graces expected of wealthy women. "You speak of it with such passion," Emma observed when Jake paused in his description of the autumn cattle drive to San Antonio. "This land, this life you've built, it's more than just a business to you, isn't it?" Her insight surprised him with its accuracy. "I suppose it is," Jake admitted. "When I came here I was running from something. This place gave me a reason to stop running and start building instead. There's something about creating something lasting with your own hands,
about being responsible for the care of living creatures that depend on you. It changes a man, gives him purpose beyond just surviving from one day to the next." Emma nodded slowly, and Jake had the impression that his words resonated with her own experience in ways he didn't yet understand. "I think I can appreciate that," she said quietly. "The idea of building something that's truly your own, something that no one can take away from you." There was a wistfulness in her voice that spoke of dreams deferred or denied. "What about you, Miss Wells?" Jake asked gently. "What kind of life were you building before whatever happened today?" He saw her stiffen slightly at the question, and he quickly added, "You don't have to tell me anything you're not comfortable sharing, but sometimes talking about troubles helps ease the burden of carrying them alone." For a long moment, Emma stared down at her hands, clearly wrestling with how much to reveal. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "I was supposed to be building the life that others had planned for me," she said, "a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt like a beautiful prison on the inside. Today was supposed to be the day I stopped having choices about my own future." Jake felt a surge of anger at the pain he could hear beneath her carefully chosen words. "Someone was forcing you into marriage," he said, "and it wasn't a question." The evidence was all there in her torn wedding dress, her injuries, and the desperation that had driven her to flee across dangerous country rather than submit to whatever fate had been arranged for her. Emma looked up at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to understand so quickly. "How did you know?" she asked. "Because no woman
runs that far in a wedding dress, unless the alternative is worse than dying alone in the wilderness," Jake replied grimly. "And because anyone who would beat a woman on her wedding day isn't the kind of man who respects the word no under any circumstances." His hands clenched into fists as he spoke, and he had to make a conscious effort to keep his voice level. "It wasn't supposed to be that way," Emma said, and Jake could hear the echo of broken dreams in her voice. "Richard Blackwood seemed like an honorable man when my father first introduced us. Wealthy, established, everything a woman was supposed to want in a husband. The arrangement made sense for both our families, and I convinced myself that affection could grow from mutual respect and shared goals." The name Blackwood made Jake's blood run cold. He knew of Richard Blackwood by reputation, a railroad baron with connections throughout Texas and beyond. The man was wealthy enough to buy and sell small towns like Dusty Creek without noticing the expense, and rumored to be ruthless in his business dealings. If Emma had been promised to a man like that, her flight represented more than just a broken engagement. It was a declaration of war against someone with the resources to hunt her to the ends of the earth. "What changed your mind?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer from the bruises on her face and the fear that had been in her eyes when he'd first found her. Emma's hand went unconsciously to her throat, where the finger-shaped bruises were darkest. "3 days ago, Richard came to my father's house for what was supposed to be a final discussion of wedding arrangements. But when I expressed some concerns about certain aspects of our future life together, he made it very clear that my opinions would not be welcome once we were married. When I suggested that perhaps we should postpone the ceremony until we could reach a better understanding, he showed me what he thought of women who questioned his decisions." Jake's vision blurred with rage as he imagined Emma being struck by a man who should have been protecting her. The fact that Blackwood had felt comfortable enough to abuse his intended bride in her father's house suggested either that he had no fear of consequences, or that Emma's father had been complicit in the arrangement regardless of his daughter's wishes. "Your father didn't intervene?" Jake asked, though the bitter laugh that escaped Emma's lips told him everything he needed to know about parental protection. "My father owes Richard Blackwood a considerable sum of money," Emma explained. "Money that he borrowed to invest in railroad stocks that proved to be worthless. The marriage was never about my happiness or even about love. It was about settling a debt that my father couldn't repay any other way." The pain in her voice was raw and unmistakable. Jake had heard similar stories before, though rarely with stakes this high. The years following the war had been financially devastating for many families, and desperate men often made bargains that seemed reasonable until the true cost became clear. Emma's father had essentially sold his daughter to pay his debts, and when she'd tried to refuse the transaction, Blackwood had shown his true nature. "So you ran," Jake said, and there was no judgment in his voice, only admiration for her courage. "I ran," Emma confirmed. "I waited until everyone was asleep, took what money I could find, and left through my bedroom window like a thief in the night. I've been traveling for 3 days, staying off the main roads, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and Dallas before anyone realized I was gone. The timeline explained Emma's current condition and why she'd appeared on his range seemingly from nowhere. 3 days of traveling cross-country on foot would have brought her from the Dallas area to this part of Texas, and her route would have taken her through some of the most desolate country in the state. That she'd survived the journey at all was a testament to both her determination and her luck. "Blackwood will come after you," Jake said, stating the obvious truth that they both knew. A man like that doesn't let a woman make him look foolish, especially not in front of business associates and social connections. He'll send people to find you, and they won't be the kind to give up easily. Emma nodded, her green eyes reflecting the same knowledge. "I know, that's why I have to keep moving. I can't stay here and put you in danger because of my problems. You've already done more than enough by helping me recover my strength." Despite her words, Jake could see the exhaustion in every line of her body and the way her hands trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup. "Miss Wells," Jake said, leaning forward in his chair so she could see the sincerity in his eyes. "Emma, you're not putting me in danger. You're giving me the chance to do something worthwhile for the first time in years. I've got defensible ground, plenty of supplies and enough firepower to make anyone think twice about causing trouble on my land. But more than that, I've got something I haven't had in a long time." "What's that?" Emma asked, though something in her expression suggested she already knew what he was going to say. "A reason to fight," Jake replied simply. "For 10 years I've been building this place and living this life, but I've been doing it all for myself. Maybe that's enough for some men, but it's never felt like enough for me. You showing up here trusting me to help you, it's the first time in years that I've felt like my strength and skills were being put to use for something that really mattered." Emma stared at him for a long moment, and Jake could see her weighing his words against whatever experiences had taught her to be cautious about trusting men with power over her situation. Finally she spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid," she said, and the admission clearly cost her. "I'm afraid that Richard will find me, and I'm afraid of what he'll do when he does. But I'm also afraid of hoping that I might actually be safe somewhere, only to have that hope destroyed when reality catches up with me." Jake reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and gently covered her hand with his own. Her fingers were slender and soft, but he could feel the strength in them and the way they trembled slightly at his touch. "Emma," he said, using her first name deliberately, "I can't promise you that trouble won't find its way here eventually. But I can promise you that while you're under my roof you're under my protection. And I can promise you that any man who wants to hurt you will have to go through me first. That includes Richard Blackwood and anyone he sends after you." The intensity of his own words surprised Jake almost as much as they seemed to surprise Emma. He'd known this woman for less than 4 hours, but something about her had awakened protective instincts that went far beyond simple chivalry or Christian duty. The thought of Richard Blackwood or his hired thugs laying hands on Emma made Jake's vision blur with rage, and he realized that somewhere in the space of a single evening, Emma Wells had become precious to him in a way that defied rational explanation. Emma's green eyes searched his face as if looking for some sign of deception or false bravado. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her because some of the tension went out of her shoulders and her fingers relaxed under his hand. She asked, echoing the same question she'd posed earlier. "Why would you risk everything you've built here for someone you barely know?" Jake considered the question seriously, knowing that his answer would set the tone for whatever developed between them. He could give her the safe response, talk about duty and honor, and the code of the West that demanded a man protect women and children. All of that would be true, but it wouldn't be the whole truth. "Because," he said finally, "in the 4 hours since I found you on that road, you've made me feel more alive than I have in 10 years. Because when I look at you, I see strength and courage and intelligence, and I see a woman who deserves the chance to build the life she wants rather than the one that's been forced on her. And because somewhere between carrying you into this house and watching you smile at my cooking, I started caring about what happens to you in a way that probably isn't smart but feels more right than anything has in a very long time." The honesty of his confession hung in the air between them, and Jake found himself holding his breath as he waited for Emma's response. He'd laid his cards on the table in a way that left him completely vulnerable, and he could only hope that his instincts about her character were as accurate as they'd always been about everything else. Emma's free hand came up to touch the bruises on her face, and Jake could see her struggling with emotions that were too complex for easy expression. When she finally spoke,
Her voice was thick with tears she was trying not to shed. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to accept help without feeling like I'm trading one form of dependence for another. I don't know how to trust my own judgment about men when I was so wrong about Richard. And I don't know how to believe that someone could care about me for who I am rather than what I represent or what I can provide for them." Jake squeezed her hand gently, feeling the weight of all the ways she'd been failed by the people who should have protected her. "Then we'll figure it out together," he said simply. "No expectations, no obligations beyond basic human decency. You stay here as long as you need to, and when you're ready to make decisions about your future, you'll make them freely without pressure from me or anyone else." For the first time since he'd found her, Emma's smile reached her eyes, and Jake felt something fundamental shift in his chest. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges they would face together or apart, this moment would remain with him as proof that sometimes fate arrived in the most unexpected packages, and that sometimes the best decisions were the ones that made no logical sense at all. Part 3. The Catalyst Event. The morning sun was painting the Texas sky in shades of gold and pink when Jake emerged from the main house to begin his daily routine of checking on the horses and cattle. The events of the previous evening felt almost dreamlike in the clear light of dawn, and for a moment he wondered if he'd imagined the whole encounter with Emma Wells. But the sight of Thunder still wearing yesterday's saddle, hastily removed and thrown over the porch railing, served as tangible proof that his life had indeed been turned upside down by a woman in a torn wedding dress. Jake had always been an early riser, a habit developed during his military service, and reinforced by 10 years of ranch life, where dawn brought both the coolest temperatures and the greatest opportunity to accomplish meaningful work before the Texas heat became unbearable. This morning, however, his usual efficiency was hampered by a distraction he couldn't quite shake. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted toward the guest room window, watching for signs that Emma was awake and wondering how she'd fared during her first night under his roof. The rational part of his mind insisted that he should be planning how to help her continue her journey safely rather than hoping she'd choose to stay longer than absolutely necessary. Emma Wells represented complications that his carefully ordered life didn't need, and Richard Blackwood was the kind of enemy that could destroy everything Jake had spent 10 years building. The smart thing would be to provide her with a horse, supplies and directions to the nearest town with a sheriff who might offer protection, then wish her well and return to his solitary existence. But rational thought seemed to have little influence over the emotions that had taken root in Jake's chest since the moment he'd first seen Emma stumbling down that dusty road. The memory of how she'd felt in his arms, the sound of her laugh when he'd mentioned his mother's potential disapproval, the way her green eyes had softened when he'd spoken about building something meaningful with his own hands, all of it combined to create a pull stronger than anything he'd experienced since returning from the war. Thunder nickered softly as Jake approached the corral, the big stallion extending his head for the customary morning greeting. Jake rubbed the horse's forehead absently, his thoughts still focused on the woman sleeping in his guest room and the dangerous situation her presence represented. Thunder had been with him since the early days of the ranch, a cavalry mount deemed too old for military service, but still possessing the intelligence and stamina that made him invaluable for managing cattle across rough terrain. "What do you think, old friend?" Jake murmured to the horse. "Am I making the biggest mistake of my life, or the smartest decision I've ever made?" Thunder's response was to nuzzle Jake's pocket in search of the apple slices he usually carried, a practical reminder that some problems were simpler than others, and that horses at least could be satisfied with straightforward solutions. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted Jake's philosophical discussion with his horse, and he turned toward the main road with the alertness of a man who'd learned to be suspicious of unexpected visitors. 3 riders were approaching the ranch at a steady pace, close enough now for Jake to make out details that did nothing to ease his growing tension. The men were well mounted on horses that showed signs of hard travel, and their clothing and equipment marked them as professionals rather than casual travelers. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward the Colt revolver holstered at his hip, a weapon he'd carried every day for 10 years but hoped never to use in anger again. The war had taught him that violence was sometimes necessary, but it had also taught him that it was always costly, even when you were on the winning side. These approaching riders had the look of men who were comfortable with such costs, and their presence so soon after Emma's arrival could hardly be coincidental. The lead rider was a lean man with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in the saddle. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of a professional, and Jake could see the careful way his eyes catalogued the defensive positions around the ranch house and outbuildings. His companions were younger but carried themselves with the same alert competence, and all three men wore their weapons with the casual ease of those who knew how to use them. "Morning," the lead rider called out as the group drew within conversational distance. His voice carried the neutral politeness of a man conducting business rather than making social calls. "Would you be Jake Morrison, owner of this spread?" "I would," Jake replied, keeping his own voice equally neutral while positioning himself where he could see all three men clearly. "What can I do for you gentlemen?" The question was polite on the surface, but Jake's tone made it clear that he wasn't extending any invitations for extended conversation. "Name's Frank Hawkins," the leader said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that managed to be both respectful and somehow mocking. "These are my associates Pete Sullivan and Charlie Mason. We're working for a businessman back in Dallas, and we're looking for someone who might have passed through this area recently." Jake felt his muscles tense at the mention of Dallas, but he kept his expression carefully neutral. "Lot of people pass through from time to time," he said. "This is open range country, and the main road to San Antonio isn't far from here. What kind of someone are you looking for?" Hawkins reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small photograph, the kind that wealthy families commissioned for formal portraits. Even from a distance, Jake could see that it showed a woman with dark hair and refined features, though the image was too formal and posed to capture the vivacity he'd seen in Emma's green eyes. "Young lady named Emma Wells," Hawkins said, holding the photograph where Jake could see it clearly. "About 25 years old, dark hair, green eyes, traveling alone under circumstances that have her family very worried about her safety. Her father hired us to bring her home safely." The lie was smoothly delivered, but Jake had heard enough lies during his military service to recognize the signs. Hawkins' story might contain elements of truth, but the man's carefully neutral expression and the way his companions had spread out to flank Jake's position suggested that this was more than a simple search and rescue mission. "Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description," Jake replied, meeting Hawkins's eyes steadily. "But then I don't get many visitors out here, especially not ladies traveling alone. Dangerous country for someone without proper escort and supplies." "Indeed it is," Hawkins agreed, his tone suggesting that he was well aware Jake was lying, but was prepared to play along for the moment. "Dangerous in ways that a sheltered young woman might not fully appreciate. Her family is particularly concerned because she left home without proper preparation, possibly in a state of emotional distress that might affect her judgment." Jake's jaw tightened at the implication that Emma was mentally unstable, a characterization that he suspected was being spread to justify whatever methods Blackwood's men were authorized to use in retrieving her. The photograph, and the story about worried family members were designed to make her capture seem like a rescue mission rather than what it actually was. "Emotional distress," Jake repeated, letting a note of skepticism creep into his voice. "What kind of distress would drive a young lady to flee her family home without proper preparation?" For just a moment, something flickered across Hawkins's face that might have been embarrassment or distaste. "Wedding nerves," he said finally. "Miss Wells was scheduled to be married yesterday to a very prominent gentleman, and apparently the reality of such a significant life change overwhelmed her. Her intended is naturally concerned about her welfare and eager to provide whatever support she needs to overcome her fears." The euphemisms were carefully chosen, but Jake could read between the lines easily enough. Emma hadn't fled because of wedding nerves, she'd fled because she'd realized what kind of man she was being forced to marry. The bruises on her face and throat were evidence of Blackwood's idea of providing support, and these men were here to drag her back to face more of the same. "Well, as I said, I haven't seen hide nor hair of anyone matching that description," Jake said, his voice carrying the finality of someone ending a conversation. "But I'll keep an eye out, and if anyone comes by asking for help, I'll be sure to mention that her family is looking for her." Hawkins studied Jake's face for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. The silence stretched uncomfortably as the two men took each other's measure, each trying to determine how far the other was willing to push the current situation. Finally Hawkins nodded slowly and tucked the photograph back into his vest. "Much obliged for your time, Mr. Morrison," he said with the same careful politeness he'd maintained throughout the conversation. "Mind if we water our horses before we continue on? It's been a long ride from town, and we've got considerable ground to cover before nightfall." The request was reasonable on the surface, but Jake recognized it for what it was, an opportunity for Hawkins and his men to get a closer look at the ranch buildings, possibly to spot some sign of Emma's presence, or to identify defensive positions for future reference. Refusing would be suspicious, but agreeing would give them access to information that could be used against him later. "Creek's over there," Jake said finally, pointing toward the water source that gave the area its name. "Help yourselves, but mind you don't spook my cattle. They're not used to strangers, and I'd rather not spend the afternoon rounding up scattered steers." "Understood," Hawkins replied, signaling to his companions to dismount. "We'll be quick about it and on our way." As the three men led their horses toward the creek, Jake found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to appear casual while remaining alert for any sign that they'd spotted evidence of Emma's presence. He busied himself with checking Thunder's shoes and adjusting the stallion's halter, tasks that kept his hands occupied while allowing him to monitor the visitors' activities. Sullivan, the youngest of the three, seemed particularly interested in the area around the main house, his eyes lingering on the guest room window and the front porch where Jake had hastily discarded Emma's torn petticoat the previous evening. The garment was gone now, burned in the kitchen stove along with other evidence of her arrival, but Jake wondered what other signs he might have missed in his haste to provide her with shelter and care. From inside the house came the faint sound of movement, and Jake's heart jumped as he realized that Emma was awake, and possibly unaware of the danger lurking just outside her window. The guest room faced away from the creek, so she wouldn't be able to see Hawkins and his men directly, but any attempt to leave the room or call out to Jake could expose her presence to the very people she was trying to avoid. Mason, the third member of the group, had wandered closer to the outbuildings, and was examining the ground with the careful attention of someone who knew how to read tracks and sign. Jake cursed silently as he realized that Emma's bare feet would have left distinctive prints in the soft earth near the porch, marks that a skilled tracker could easily identify as belonging to a woman of her approximate size and weight. "Interesting tracks here," Mason called out to his companions, confirming Jake's worst fears. "Looks like someone was walking around without boots or shoes. Recent too, probably yesterday evening or early this morning." Hawkins straightened from where he'd been kneeling beside the creek, his attention now focused entirely on Mason's discovery. "Could be anyone," he said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe his own words. "Ranch hand with worn-out boots maybe, or someone who took them off to wade in the creek." "Maybe," Mason agreed, but he continued to study the ground with obvious interest. "Though these look more like a woman's feet to me. Small, narrow, not the kind of prints you'd expect from someone used to going barefoot on rough ground." Jake felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was mounting quickly, and he could see Hawkins beginning to put the pieces together. In a few more minutes, the man would have enough information to justify a more thorough search of the ranch, and Emma's hiding place would be discovered. That was when Thunder decided to intervene in the situation with the kind of dramatic timing that Jake would have found amusing under different circumstances. The big stallion had been growing increasingly agitated, as the strangers moved around his territory, and Sullivan's approach to the corral fence finally triggered the horse's protective instincts. Thunder reared up on his hind legs with a thunderous whinny that echoed off the surrounding hills, his front hooves striking the air inches from Sullivan's startled face. The young man stumbled backward, lost his footing, and landed hard in the muddy edge of the creek with a splash that sent water spraying in all directions. His horse, already nervous from the journey and the unfamiliar surroundings, spooked at the commotion and bolted toward the open range, trailing its reins behind it. "Son of a," Sullivan began, then caught himself as he struggled to his feet, water dripping from his clothes and dignity clearly wounded along with his backside. Thunder continued to pace along the corral fence, snorting and tossing his head in a display of territorial dominance that would have been impressive under any circumstances. Jake moved quickly to calm his horse, speaking in the low, soothing tones that had always worked to settle Thunder's occasional fits of temperament. "Easy there, old friend," he murmured, placing a steadying hand on the stallion's neck. "These fellows were just leaving, weren't you, gentlemen?" Hawkins was clearly struggling to maintain his professional composure while his youngest companion dripped creek water and his horses milled about nervously. "Seems your horse doesn't much care for strangers," he observed, his voice tight with controlled irritation. "Thunder's been with me since the war," Jake replied, continuing to stroke the horse's neck while keeping his eyes on the three men. "He's got strong opinions about people who don't belong on his range, and he's usually pretty good at reading character. I've learned to trust his judgment over the years." The implication was clear enough that Hawkins' jaw tightened visibly, but the man was too professional to rise to such obvious bait. Instead, he signaled to Mason to help Sullivan catch his wayward mount, while maintaining the facade of polite business that had characterized their entire encounter. "We appreciate your hospitality, Mr. Morrison," Hawkins said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that managed to convey both courtesy and threat. "If you should happen to encounter Miss Wells during your travels, I hope you'll remember that her family is very concerned about her welfare. Very concerned and very motivated to ensure her safe return." "I'll keep that in mind," Jake replied, his own voice carrying undertones that suggested exactly what he thought of Blackwood's version of family concern. "And I'll be sure to mention to anyone I meet that there are folks asking questions about a young lady's whereabouts. Folks get nervous when strangers come around asking about missing women, especially when those strangers aren't wearing badges or carrying any official authority." The verbal thrust hit its mark, and Jake saw Hawkins' hand move slightly toward his weapon before the man caught himself and forced his expression back to neutral professionalism. "No badges needed for family business, Mr. Morrison, but I appreciate your concern for proper procedure." Sullivan had finally managed to catch his horse with Mason's help, though his clothes were still dripping, and his mood had clearly soured considerably. He shot Thunder a resentful look as he prepared to remount, but the big stallion simply snorted and turned away as if dismissing him as unworthy of further attention. "Time to move on," Hawkins announced, swinging back into his saddle with fluid ease. "Lots of ground to cover, and Miss Wells's trail won't stay fresh forever." He paused as if struck by a sudden thought. "Course, if she did happen to show up here looking for help, I imagine a man of your obvious character would want to make sure she got the proper care and protection. Wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen to a lost young lady, especially not when her family is so eager to welcome her home." The threat was delicately phrased but unmistakable, and Jake felt his temper flare at the implied suggestion that Emma might meet with an accident if she remained beyond Blackwood's reach. "Any woman who asked for my protection would get it,"
he said flatly. "And anyone who tried to harm a guest under my roof would find out exactly what kind of character I really have." For a moment, the pretense of civilized conversation fell away entirely, and Jake found himself looking into the cold, calculating eyes of a professional killer. Hawkins had clearly heard the challenge in Jake's words and was weighing the risks and benefits of settling the matter immediately, rather than waiting for a more convenient opportunity. The tension stretched between them like a wire drawn too tight, and Jake could feel his hand hovering near his gun, while his mind calculated angles and distances with the automatic precision of someone who'd survived too many similar confrontations. Thunder sensed the danger, and began pawing the ground restlessly, adding his own warning to the volatile mixture of threat and counter-threat that filled the morning air. Then the moment passed, and Hawkins visibly forced himself to relax, though his eyes remained hard and watchful. "Appreciate the hospitality, Mr. Morrison," he said again, wheeling his horse toward the main road. "We'll be moving on now, but I suspect we'll be back in this area before too long. Country like this, a man tends to cover the same ground more than once when he's looking for something important." "You're welcome to use the main road any time," Jake replied, his tone making it clear that the main road was the extent of any welcome these men could expect. "It's public thoroughfare after all. Just remember that everything on either side of that road for the next 5 miles is private property, and I take a dim view of trespassers." Hawkins nodded with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Understood. We'll be sure to respect property lines and local customs. Wouldn't want to cause any unnecessary friction with the neighbors." The three riders departed at the same steady pace they'd maintained on arrival, but Jake noticed that Sullivan kept looking back over his shoulder as if hoping for another chance to settle accounts with Thunder. Mason was studying the ground as they rode, no doubt memorizing landmarks and defensive positions for future reference. Hawkins himself rode with the relaxed alertness of a man who'd accomplished his primary objective even if he hadn't achieved everything he'd hoped for. Jake remained in the yard watching until the riders disappeared over a low rise, then waited another 10 minutes to ensure they weren't doubling back for a surprise return visit. Only when he was completely satisfied that they'd actually departed, did he allow himself to hurry back toward the house, his mind racing with the implications of what had just occurred. Emma was standing at the kitchen window when he entered, her face pale but determined as she watched the horizon where the riders had vanished. She'd managed to find one of his old shirts and a pair of work pants that she'd belted tightly around her slender waist, creating a practical outfit that was far more suitable for ranch life than the ruins of her wedding dress. Her dark hair was braided back in a simple style that emphasized the delicate bone structure of her face and made the bruises stand out even more starkly against her pale skin. "They were looking for me," she said without preamble, her voice steady despite the fear Jake could see in her green eyes. "I heard voices and saw them through the window." "That was Frank Hawkins, wasn't it? Richard's head of security." Jake nodded grimly, impressed despite himself by Emma's composure under pressure. Many women would have been hysterical after overhearing such a conversation, but she was clearly made of sterner stuff than her refined appearance might suggest. "You know him?" Jake asked, moving to stand beside her at the window. Up close, he could smell the faint scent of the soap she'd used to wash, mixed with the lingering aroma of the coffee he'd left for her earlier. "I've seen him at Richard's office and social gatherings," Emma replied, unconsciously wrapping her arms around herself as if warding off a chill. "Richard likes to surround himself with dangerous men. I think it makes him feel powerful to know that he can command their loyalty with money and fear. Hawkins has a reputation for finding people who don't want to be found, and for handling situations that require a certain degree of discretion." The euphemism was delicate, but Jake understood perfectly what kind of discretion Emma was referring to. Hawkins was the type of man who made problems disappear permanently when more conventional solutions proved inadequate. His presence here meant that Blackwood was serious about retrieving his wayward bride, and wasn't particularly concerned about what methods might be necessary to accomplish that goal. "How much did you hear?" Jake asked, settling into a chair at the kitchen table and gesturing for Emma to join him. They needed to discuss their situation honestly, and he wanted to gauge how much she understood about the danger they were both now facing. "Enough," Emma said, taking the seat across from him. "Enough to know that they're not going to simply give up and go home. Richard doesn't tolerate defiance, especially not from women, and especially not when it makes him look foolish in front of his business associates. He'll keep sending men until either they find me, or until something happens to make him believe I'm no longer a threat to his reputation." Jake felt a chill at the implication in her words. "Something like what?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Something like my death," Emma replied with the kind of matter-of-fact tone that suggested she'd already considered and accepted this possibility. "If I can't be retrieved and returned to fulfill my obligations, then the next best solution from Richard's perspective would be for me to meet with some kind of tragic accident. A woman overcome by guilt and shame perhaps, who took her own life rather than face the consequences of her rash behavior." The casual way she discussed her own potential murder made Jake's blood run cold. This wasn't the idle speculation of someone imagining worst-case scenarios, this was the calculated assessment of someone who understood exactly how a man like Blackwood operated and what he was capable of when his interests were threatened. "That's not going to happen," Jake said firmly, leaning forward to meet her eyes directly. "I meant what I told you last night, Emma. You're under my protection now and I don't give my word lightly. Hawkins and his men can come back with an army if they want to, but they're not taking you anywhere you don't want to go." Emma searched his face as if looking for some sign of doubt or false bravado, but whatever she found there seemed to reassure her. "You don't understand what you're up against," she said softly. "Richard Blackwood isn't just wealthy, he's connected to people throughout the territory who owe him favors or depend on his goodwill for their own prosperity. Judges, sheriffs, politicians, business leaders, they'll all side with him if he presents this as a matter of a concerned fiancé trying to help a mentally unstable woman." "Then we'll have to make sure it doesn't come to that," Jake replied, his mind already working through the practical challenges they faced. "Hawkins and his men know you're in this area, but they don't have proof that you're here specifically. As long as we're careful and don't give them any additional evidence, they can't move against us openly without risking legal complications of their own." Emma nodded slowly, clearly following his reasoning. "But they'll be watching," she said, "and waiting for an opportunity to catch me away from the ranch, or to find some excuse to search the buildings. How long can we maintain that kind of deception?" It was a fair question, and one that Jake didn't have a good answer for. Hawkins struck him as the patient type, someone who would be content to watch and wait for as long as necessary if he believed his target was within reach. The man had resources and time, while Jake and Emma were essentially trapped on the ranch, unable to travel freely without risking exposure. Long enough, Jake said finally, though he wasn't entirely convinced himself. Long enough for us to figure out a permanent solution to this problem. What kind of permanent solution? Emma asked, though something in her expression suggested she already suspected what he was thinking. Jake was quiet for a moment, weighing his words carefully. What he was about to suggest would change everything between them, possibly in ways that neither of them was prepared for, but the alternatives were worse, and time was not on their side. Marriage, he said simply. Legal marriage, with proper documentation and witnesses. Once you're Mrs. Jake Morrison, Blackwood's claim on you becomes a lot more complicated. He can't simply drag you back to Dallas as a runaway bride if you're already someone else's wife. Emma stared at him in shock, clearly not having expected such a direct proposal. Jake, you can't be serious. You barely know me, and I barely know you. Marriage is not something to be entered into lightly, especially not as a legal maneuver to avoid other problems. I'm perfectly serious, Jake replied, though he could understand her amazement. And you're right that we don't know each other well yet, but I know enough about your character to respect you, and I hope you know enough about mine to trust me. This wouldn't have to be a real marriage in the conventional sense, at least not until or unless we both decided we wanted it to be. The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with implications and possibilities that neither of them was quite ready to examine too closely. Emma was clearly struggling with the magnitude of what he was suggesting, and Jake found himself holding his breath as he waited for her response. You would do that for me? She asked. Finally, her voice barely above a whisper. You would marry a woman you've known for less than a day, take on her enemies as your own, risk everything you've built here, all to keep me safe. Yes, Jake said without hesitation. I would do exactly that, and I'd consider myself fortunate to have the opportunity. The conviction in his voice seemed to surprise them both, but Jake realized as he spoke the words that they were completely true. Emma was quiet for a long time, staring down at her hands as she wrestled with emotions and considerations that Jake could only guess at. Finally, she looked up at him with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and something deeper that made his pulse quicken. If we did this, she said carefully, if we went through with such an arrangement, what would you expect from me? What kind of wife would you want me to be? The question was more complex than it appeared on the surface, and Jake could hear the fear beneath her words. Fear that she would be trading one form of servitude for another, that marriage to him might prove to be only marginally better than marriage to Blackwood. Her experiences had clearly taught her to be suspicious of men who claimed to want to protect her, especially when that protection came with strings attached. I would expect you to be yourself, Jake said honestly. I would expect you to have opinions and express them, to make decisions about your own life, to be a partner rather than a possession. I built this ranch with my own hands, but I've always imagined that someday I'd share it with someone who could help me make it into something even better, someone who could bring her own strengths and ideas to bear on our common goals. The concept seemed to be almost foreign to Emma's experience, and Jake realized with growing anger just how thoroughly Blackwood and the men in her past had failed to treat her as an equal human being. The fact that she found the idea of partnership revolutionary spoke volumes about the kind of relationships she'd been exposed to throughout her life. And if I agreed to this arrangement, Emma continued, clearly working through the practical implications, what would happen when Hawkins comes back? Because he will come back, Jake. Richard won't let this go, and marriage or no marriage, he'll find a way to justify taking me back to Dallas. Then we'll be ready for him, Jake replied grimly. As your husband, I'd have legal standing to defend you against anyone who tried to take you against your will. And as someone who's been dealing with dangerous men for most of his adult life, I'd have practical standing to make such an attempt extremely costly for anyone foolish enough to try it. Emma nodded slowly, and Jake could see her weighing the risks and benefits of his proposal against her limited alternatives. She was intelligent enough to understand that marriage to him would provide legal protection while potentially creating other complications, and practical enough to recognize that her options were severely constrained by Blackwood's resources and determination. There's something else you should know, Emma said finally,
her voice taking on the careful tone of someone about to reveal an important truth, something that might change how you feel about offering me such protection. Jake felt his stomach tighten with apprehension, wondering what additional complications were about to be added to an already complex situation. What is it? Emma took a deep breath, clearly steeling herself for his reaction. I'm not just Richard Blackwood's intended bride. I'm also the sole heir to my father's business interests, which include significant holdings in railroad development and cattle operations throughout Texas. The marriage arrangement wasn't just about settling my father's debts, it was about consolidating control of those assets under Richard's management. The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow as he realized the true scope of what was at stake. Emma wasn't just a runaway bride, she was a missing heiress whose disappearance had potentially disrupted major business deals worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Blackwood's determination to retrieve her wasn't just about wounded pride or male ego, it was about controlling assets that could make or break his future business plans. How significant are these holdings? Jake asked, though he suspected from Emma's expression that the answer was going to be worse than he'd feared. Significant enough that my disappearance will have already caused considerable disruption in several ongoing projects, Emma replied. Richard was counting on gaining control of those assets through our marriage, and my father was counting on Richard's financial backing to avoid bankruptcy. Without the marriage, both men stand to lose substantial amounts of money and influence. Jake felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. Emma wasn't just running from an abusive husband, she was running from men who saw her as the key to controlling vast business enterprises. Her marriage to Blackwood had been intended to legitimize what amounted to a corporate takeover disguised as a romantic arrangement, which means, Jake said slowly, that Blackwood will never stop looking for you. He can't afford to let you disappear permanently, because doing so would mean losing access to assets worth more than most people see in a lifetime. Exactly, Emma confirmed. And it means that anyone who helps me, anyone who gets in Richard's way becomes a target for the kind of pressure that men with his resources can bring to bear. I should have told you this last night, but I was so grateful for your help that I didn't want to frighten you away with the full truth about what you were risking. Jake was quiet for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what Emma had just revealed and what it meant for both their futures. The smart thing would be to help her disappear completely, possibly providing her with enough money and supplies to reach California or Oregon where she might be able to start over under a new identity. Marriage to him would only paint a larger target on both their backs and guarantee that Blackwood would eventually bring enough force to bear to overcome any defenses Jake could mount. But as he looked at Emma's face, seeing the fear and resignation that she was trying so hard to hide, Jake realized that smart had stopped being relevant the moment he'd first taken her in his arms. She was more than just a woman in trouble, she was someone who'd awakened feelings in him that he'd thought were buried forever. The idea of sending her away to face an uncertain future alone was simply unacceptable, regardless of the risks involved. Emma, he said finally, reaching across the table to take her hand in his, what you've just told me doesn't change anything about my offer. If anything, it makes me more determined to see this through. You're not a business asset to be traded between men for their profit, and you're not going to spend the rest of your life running from people who see you as nothing more than a means to an end. The relief that flooded Emma's features was almost heartbreaking in its intensity. You're certain, even knowing what you'd be up against, even understanding that this could cost you everything you've worked for? I'm certain, Jake replied firmly. The only question is whether you're willing to trust me enough to become my wife even under these circumstances. I know it's not the romantic proposal that most women dream of, and I know the timing isn't ideal, but I meant what I said about wanting a partner, rather than just a dependent. If you'll have me, Emma Wells, I'd be honored to call you my wife. Emma stared at him for a long moment, and Jake could see her searching his face for some sign of doubt or hidden agenda. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she squeezed his hand gently, and gave him the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since their initial meeting. Yes, she said simply. Yes, Jake Morrison, I'll marry you, and I'll do my best to be the kind of partner you deserve, even if I'm still learning what that means. The decision settled between them with the weight of absolute commitment, and Jake felt something fundamental shift in his chest as he realized that his life had just changed in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. Emma Wells was about to become Emma Morrison, and together they would face whatever challenges Blackwood and his allies could bring against them. Outside, the morning sun continued its climb toward noon, and somewhere in the distance, Frank Hawkins and his men were planning their next move in a game that had just become infinitely more complex and dangerous for everyone involved. The decision to marry had been made in the stark light of necessity, but the days that followed revealed depths to both Jake and Emma that surprised them with their complexity and compatibility. Emma threw herself into learning the rhythms of ranch life with the same determination that had carried her across miles of hostile terrain to escape an unwanted marriage. She proved to be remarkably adaptable, picking up skills that most city-bred women would have considered beneath their station with an enthusiasm that spoke of genuine interest rather than mere politeness. Jake found himself watching her more closely than he cared to admit, noting the way she moved through his daily routines with increasing confidence. Her hands, soft from a lifetime of privilege, quickly developed calluses from helping with the endless tasks that kept a ranch functioning. She learned to milk the 2 cows he kept for household use, to gather eggs from the temperamental hens that ruled the chicken coop with iron determination, and to prepare meals that could satisfy a working man's appetite without wasting precious supplies. More importantly, she learned to read his moods and rhythms in the same way that he was learning to read hers. Jake had been alone for so long that he'd forgotten the particular pleasure of sharing observations about the weather, the livestock, and the 1,000 small details that made up daily life on the frontier. Emma's perspective, shaped by her Eastern education and refined upbringing, offered insights that he would never have considered on his own. "Your cattle are remarkably healthy," she observed one afternoon as they watched the herd grazing in the south pasture. "The books I've read about livestock management suggested that disease and parasites were constant problems for ranchers, but yours seem to thrive despite the harsh conditions." Jake felt a flush of pride at her recognition of something he'd worked years to achieve. "Clean water and good grass," he explained. "Most problems come from overcrowding and poor drainage. I keep my numbers manageable, and rotate the grazing areas to prevent overuse. Costs me some short-term profit, but it pays off in the long run with healthier animals and better breeding stock. It's sustainable," Emma said, clearly understanding the long-term thinking behind his methods. "You're building something that will last rather than simply extracting maximum profit from the immediate resources. Most of the businessmen my father dealt with could never think beyond the current fiscal quarter." The conversation revealed more about Emma's background than she might have intended. Her casual reference to fiscal quarters and business management spoke of someone who'd been exposed to high-level commercial decision-making, possibly as more than just a passive observer. Jake found himself wondering exactly what role she'd played in her father's business interests, and how much practical knowledge she possessed about the industries that Blackwood was trying to control. "Tell me about your father's business," Jake said carefully, settling onto a fallen log that provided a good vantage point for watching the herd. "What kind of operations was he involved in before Blackwood came into the picture?" Emma joined him on the log, her expression growing thoughtful as she considered how much to reveal. "Railroad development primarily, though he also had interests in cattle ranching, mining, and freight transportation. The idea was to create an integrated system where each component supported the others. Railroads to move cattle and goods, ranches to provide livestock for eastern markets, mines to supply raw materials for railroad construction, freight companies to handle distribution and logistics." The scope of the operation impressed Jake despite himself. Emma's father had been thinking on a scale that dwarfed individual ranch operations like his own, creating networks of interconnected businesses that could dominate entire regions of the developing West. It was exactly the kind of ambitious vision that would have attracted someone like Blackwood, who specialized in consolidating control over large-scale enterprises. "Sounds like a solid plan," Jake observed. "What went wrong?" Emma's laugh held no humor. "What always goes wrong with ambitious plans that depend on other people's money and cooperation? My father overextended himself financially, trusting partners who were more interested in quick profits than long-term success. When several key investments failed simultaneously, he found himself owing substantial sums to people who weren't inclined to be patient about repayment, including Blackwood." Jake said, beginning to understand the leverage that had made Emma's forced marriage seem like a reasonable solution to her father's problems, including Richard. Yes, Emma confirmed. He'd provided financing for several railroad construction projects, and when those projects failed to generate expected returns, my father became liable for amounts that would have bankrupted him completely. The marriage arrangement was presented as a merger of business interests that would benefit both families, but in reality, it was a way for Richard to acquire control of assets worth far more than the debts my father owed. The picture that emerged was one of calculated manipulation by a man who specialized in engineering financial crises that could be resolved only through arrangements that served his interests. Blackwood had probably orchestrated at least some of the failures that had left Emma's father desperate for solutions, creating the very problem that he then offered to solve through marriage. "And you understood all this when you agreed to the engagement?" Jake asked, trying to gauge how much Emma had known about the true nature of the arrangement. "I understood some of it," Emma admitted. "I knew that my father was in financial trouble, and that marriage to Richard would solve those problems. I also knew that refusing would mean watching my father lose everything he'd worked to build. What I didn't understand was exactly what kind of man I would be marrying or what my life would be like once I was completely under his control." The pain in her voice when she spoke of her father's situation revealed the conflict that had made her initial acceptance of the arrangement understandable. Emma had been faced with an impossible choice between her own happiness and her family's financial survival, and she'd initially chosen sacrifice over selfishness. Only when Blackwood's true nature had been revealed had she found the courage to flee rather than submit to a life of abuse disguised as marriage. "What changed your mind?" Jake asked gently. "What made you decide that running was worth the risk?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focused on the distant horizon where heat waves shimmered above the grass. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but filled with remembered pain. "3 nights before the wedding, Richard came to dinner at my father's house," she said. "The conversation turned to business matters, and I made the mistake of offering an opinion about one of the railroad projects. Nothing controversial, just a suggestion about alternative routing that might reduce construction costs and improve long-term profitability." Jay could already sense where the story was heading, and he felt his jaw clench with anger at what was coming. "Richard's response was to inform me that wives didn't involve themselves in business decisions, and that I would need to learn to keep my opinions to myself once we were married," Emma continued. "When I pointed out that the assets in question had originally belonged to my family and that I might have legitimate insights worth considering, he became quite clear about what he thought of women who presumed to question their husband's judgment." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the violence that Emma was describing, and Jake found his hands clenching into fists as he imagined the scene. "He struck you," Jake said, "and it wasn't a question." "He struck me," Emma confirmed. "And when I fell, he made it very clear that I should consider it a mild preview of what would happen if I ever questioned his authority again. My father was present for all of this, and his only concern was whether I understood that such behavior was perfectly normal and acceptable within the bounds of marriage." The betrayal by her father might have been even worse than the violence from Blackwood, Jake realized. Emma had been abandoned by the one person who should have protected her, sold to a man who saw her as property rather than a human being with rights and feelings of her own. The courage it had taken for her to flee such a situation, knowing that she would have no support from her family and no resources beyond what she could carry, was staggering. "So you ran," Jake said, and the admiration in his voice was unmistakable. "So I ran," Emma agreed. "I realized that I had a choice between a lifetime of submitting to that kind of treatment and the possibility of dying
free rather than living as a slave. It seemed like an easy decision once I understood the alternatives clearly." The conversation had revealed more about Emma's character than weeks of casual interaction might have accomplished, and Jake found himself feeling a deep respect for the strength that had carried her through such an ordeal. She wasn't just a victim fleeing an unpleasant situation. She was a woman who'd made a conscious choice to risk everything rather than accept a life that would have destroyed her spirit. "Emma," Jake said carefully, "I want you to know that what you've described, what Blackwood did to you and what your father allowed to happen, that's not normal or acceptable behavior from any man worth calling himself one. Marriage should be a partnership between equals, not a license for one person to dominate and abuse another. Emma turned to look at him with an expression that was equal parts hope and skepticism. Is that really what you believe, or is that what you think I need to hear right now? The question revealed the depth of damage that had been done to Emma's ability to trust, and Jake realized that his words alone wouldn't be enough to convince her that not all men were like Blackwood and her father. He would have to prove his commitment to treating her as an equal partner through his actions over time, building trust slowly and carefully. It's what I believe, Jake said firmly. And it's what I intend to demonstrate every day for as long as we're together. You've already proven that you're intelligent, resourceful, and capable of making good decisions under pressure. I'd be a fool not to value those qualities and seek your input on matters that affect both our lives. The simple acknowledgement of her capabilities seemed to affect Emma more deeply than elaborate declarations of love might have. Jake could see her processing the idea that she might actually be valued for her mind and judgment rather than just her appearance and childbearing potential. I've never had that, she said quietly. I've never had someone treat my opinions as worthwhile or ask for my advice about important matters. I'm not even sure I know how to be that kind of partner. Then we'll learn together, Jake replied. I've never had a partner in the true sense either. I've been making all my own decisions for so long that I'll probably need to learn how to share responsibility and consider someone else's perspective before taking action. The mutual admission of inexperience seemed to ease some of the tension between them, acknowledging that their unconventional marriage would require adjustments and compromises from both sides. They were embarking on an experiment in partnership that had no predetermined outcome, creating something new rather than conforming to existing expectations about marital roles. As the afternoon progressed into evening, they found themselves talking about everything from books they'd read to places they'd like to travel, discovering shared interests and compatible perspectives that surprised them both. Emma's education had been extensive, covering literature, languages, and philosophy in addition to the practical subjects that wealthy families considered appropriate for their daughters. Jake's own learning had been more practical but equally thorough, encompassing military strategy, livestock management, and the dozen other skills required for survival on the frontier. You're much more educated than most people would expect from a rancher, Emma observed as they discussed a book of poetry they'd both read. Where did you learn so much about literature and philosophy? Jake smiled at the surprise in her voice. Same place I learned about military tactics and animal husbandry, he said. From reading every book I could get my hands on during the long winter evenings. A man gets lonely enough and books start to feel like conversation with friends you haven't met yet. The admission revealed a side of Jake that Emma clearly hadn't expected, and he could see her reassessing her assumptions about the kind of man she'd agreed to marry. The frontier had produced its share of rough, uneducated men who valued strength and practical skills over intellectual pursuits, but Jake's isolated lifestyle had driven him to seek mental stimulation wherever he could find it. I brought some books with me when I fled, Emma said hesitantly. Hidden in my traveling bag along with other things I thought I might need. Would you like to see them? The offer felt like a significant gesture of trust, an invitation to share something personal and precious that she'd managed to save from her old life. Jake nodded, curious to see what volumes Emma had considered important enough to carry with her during her desperate flight. The books she produced from her carefully packed bag revealed as much about her character as any conversation could have. There were volumes of poetry by Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Christina Rossetti, a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and a practical guide to household management that had clearly been well used. But it was the final volume that surprised Jake the most, a detailed treatise on cattle breeding and ranch management that looked like it had been studied extensively. Interesting reading for a city-bred lady, Jake observed, holding up the cattle management book. Planning to become a rancher yourself? Emma blushed slightly but met his eyes directly. I've been interested in agricultural sciences for years, though my father considered it an inappropriate hobby for a woman of my social position. I thought that perhaps someday I might have the opportunity to apply some of those theories in practice. The revelation that Emma had been secretly studying ranch management felt like fate intervening in their lives. Here was a woman who'd not only accepted his proposal of marriage but who might actually be able to contribute meaningfully to the operation of his ranch. The combination of her theoretical knowledge and his practical experience could create something neither of them could achieve alone. Show me what you've learned, Jake said, genuinely curious about her insights. What would you do differently if this were your operation? Emma's eyes lit up with enthusiasm as she opened the well-worn book to a section she'd clearly studied extensively. Water management, she said immediately. Your current system works well for the size of your herd, but if you wanted to expand operations you'd need to think about irrigation and conservation during dry periods. There are techniques here for creating retention ponds and distribution channels that could support twice as many cattle on the same amount of land. Jake leaned closer to examine the diagrams she was showing him, impressed by the sophistication of the engineering concepts involved. The ideas weren't just theoretical, they were practical solutions that could be implemented with materials and labor available on the frontier. Emma had clearly spent considerable time thinking about how to apply these principles in real-world situations. That's not all, Emma continued, warming to her subject. Selective breeding programs could improve both the size and disease resistance of your stock over several generations. The key is maintaining detailed records of lineage and performance, then making breeding decisions based on data rather than just visual assessment. The passion in her voice as she described these concepts reminded Jake of how he'd felt when he'd first started building his ranch, the excitement of creating something new and meaningful from raw materials and careful planning. Emma wasn't just interested in ranch management as an abstract subject, she was genuinely excited about the possibility of putting these ideas into practice. You've given this a lot of thought, Jake observed, noting the annotations and calculations that filled the margins of her book. How long have you been studying agricultural sciences? Since I was 16, Emma admitted. My governess thought it was an unsuitable interest for a young lady, but my father's library had several volumes on the subject, and I found them fascinating. The idea of working with the land to create sustainable prosperity appealed to me much more than the social obligations that were supposed to occupy my time. Jake could hear the wistfulness in her voice as she spoke of dreams that had been discouraged and interests that had been dismissed as inappropriate for someone of her gender and social position. Emma had been trapped not just by her father's financial problems but by a society that refused to acknowledge that women might have valuable contributions to make beyond their roles as wives and mothers. What other ideas have you been developing? Jake asked, settling more comfortably beside her as she continued to share her plans and theories. Emma's response revealed the depth of thought she'd put into agricultural innovation during her years of enforced idleness. She described crop rotation systems that could improve soil fertility while providing supplemental feed for livestock, experimental techniques for preserving meat and dairy products that could extend their market viability, and marketing strategies that could command premium prices for superior quality products. The railroad development my father was involved in could have created opportunities for ranchers to reach eastern markets directly, Emma explained, her voice taking on the analytical tone of someone discussing complex business strategies. Instead of selling to middlemen at reduced prices, producers could ship their own products and capture the full value of their work, but it would require cooperation between multiple ranchers and careful coordination of shipping schedules and quality standards. The vision she described was ambitious and forward-thinking, recognizing that individual success in agricultural enterprises was increasingly dependent on broader market forces and cooperative strategies. Emma understood that the future of ranching lay not just in producing good cattle but in controlling the entire supply chain from pasture to consumer. You're talking about forming a ranchers' cooperative, Jake said, impressed by the sophistication of her thinking. Pooling resources and sharing risks to compete with the large corporate operations that are starting to dominate the market. Exactly, Emma confirmed. The small independent producers have advantages in quality and flexibility, but they lack the scale and organization to compete effectively with operations backed by significant capital. A cooperative structure could provide those advantages while allowing individual ranchers to maintain control of their own operations. The conversation continued well into the evening, with Emma sharing insights gleaned from years of study and Jake contributing practical knowledge gained from actual experience managing livestock and land. They found themselves building on each other's ideas, creating plans that neither could have developed alone. As they talked, Jake became increasingly aware of Emma's physical presence beside him. The way her eyes sparkled when she discussed ideas that excited her, the graceful movements of her hands as she illustrated concepts from her books, the soft scent of her hair when she leaned closer to show him particular passages. The attraction he'd felt since first meeting her was deepening into something more complex and powerful. Emma seemed equally affected by their proximity and collaboration. Jake caught her watching him with an expression that went beyond intellectual interest, and when their hands accidentally touched as they reached for the same book, neither of them pulled away immediately. The awareness between them was becoming impossible to ignore, complicated by the unconventional circumstances of their engagement and the very real dangers that surrounded them. Emma, Jake said finally, setting aside the book they'd been examining and turning to face her directly. I want you to know that when I proposed marriage to you, I meant every word about wanting a true partnership, but I also want you to know that my feelings for you go beyond just practical considerations or protective instincts. Emma's breath caught slightly at his words, and Jake could see her pulse quickening at the base of her throat. What are you saying? She asked softly.
I'm saying that somewhere between finding you on that road and sitting here planning our future together, I've started falling in love with you, Jake replied honestly. Not with the idea of you or with what you represent, but with you specifically. Your intelligence, your courage, your determination to build something meaningful despite everything you've been through. The admission hung in the air between them, vulnerable and honest in a way that made Jake's heart race with anticipation and fear. He'd laid his feelings bare without knowing how Emma would respond, risking the comfortable partnership they'd been building for the possibility of something deeper and more meaningful. Emma stared at him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face as if looking for some sign of deception or false sentiment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I think I've been falling in love with you too, she said. I didn't expect it to happen so quickly, and I'm still afraid to trust these feelings completely, but I can't deny that they exist. You've shown me a kind of respect and consideration that I never knew was possible between a man and a woman. The mutual confession seemed to break down some invisible barrier between them, and Jake found himself reaching out to cup Emma's face gently in his hands. Her skin was soft and warm beneath his palms, and he could feel the slight tremor that ran through her at his touch. May I kiss you? He asked, wanting her explicit consent rather than assuming permission based on their engagement. Instead of answering with words, Emma leaned forward to close the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was gentle at first, but quickly deepened as they both gave in to feelings that had been building for days. Jake had kissed women before, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the intensity of emotion that Emma's response awakened in him. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Jake could see his own desire reflected in Emma's flushed face and darkened eyes. The physical attraction between them was undeniable, but it was built on a foundation of genuine affection and mutual respect that made it infinitely more powerful than mere lust. I never thought I could feel this way about anyone, Emma said softly, her hand still resting on Jake's chest where she could feel his rapid heartbeat. Richard's attentions always made me feel diminished and powerless, but when you touch me, when you look at me, I feel valued and cherished. The comparison to Blackwood's treatment made Jake's jaw clench with renewed anger, but he forced himself to focus on Emma's needs rather than his own desire for revenge. You are valued and cherished, he said firmly, more than you may ever fully understand. Whatever happens next, whatever challenges we face together, I want you to remember that. Emma nodded, tears of relief and happiness glistening in her eyes. I'll remember, she promised, and I'll do everything I can to be worthy of such feelings. You're already worthy, Jake replied, pulling her closer so that she was resting against his side. You've been worthy from the moment you had the courage to choose freedom over security, to risk everything rather than accept a life that would have destroyed your spirit. They sat together in comfortable silence as the evening deepened around them, both processing the magnitude of what had just occurred between them. The marriage that had begun as a practical arrangement for mutual protection was becoming something much more significant, a genuine partnership built on love and respect rather than mere convenience. The sound of approaching horses in the distance broke the peaceful moment, and Jake immediately tensed as he recognized the potential danger. It was too late in the day for casual visitors, and too soon for Hawkins and his men to have returned unless they discovered new information that demanded immediate action. Stay here, Jake said quietly, reaching for the rifle that was never far from his side. Keep the lamp low and don't show yourself at the windows until I know who's out there. Emma nodded, understanding instinctively that their moment of peace was about to be interrupted by the harsh realities of their situation. She moved quickly to extinguish most of the lamps while Jake positioned himself where he could observe the approaching riders without being easily seen. But as the horses drew closer, Jake recognized the familiar silhouette of Doc Patterson's buggy, accompanied by what appeared to be Sheriff Henderson on his distinctive pinto gelding. The two men were among the few people in the area that Jake considered genuinely trustworthy, and their presence at this hour suggested something significant had occurred. It's all right, Jake called to Emma as he opened the front door. It's Doc Patterson and Sheriff Henderson. They're friends. Doc Patterson was a man in his 60s who'd been practicing medicine on the frontier for most of his adult life. He'd served as an army surgeon during the war and had seen enough violence and suffering to appreciate the value of peace and human dignity. Sheriff Henderson was younger but equally principled, a man who'd taken his oath to protect and serve seriously, and who commanded respect throughout the county for his fairness and competence. Evening, Jake, Doc Patterson said as the two men dismounted. Sorry to disturb you so late, but we've got some information you need to hear. Come in, Jake replied, stepping aside to allow his visitors to enter. Emma, these are two of the best men in the county, Doc Patterson and Sheriff Walt Henderson. Emma emerged from the kitchen where she'd been waiting, and Jake could see both men taking note of her bruised face and the way she carried herself with the careful dignity of someone who'd recently endured trauma. Doc Patterson's professional eye immediately assessed her condition, while Sheriff Henderson's expression darkened with anger at the obvious signs of abuse. "Ma'am," both men said respectfully, removing their hats as Emma approached. "Gentlemen," Emma replied with the poise that her expensive education had instilled in her. "I'm pleased to meet friends of Jake's, though I apologize for the circumstances." "No apology necessary," Doc Patterson said gently. "From what we've learned tonight, you've got nothing to apologize for and plenty to be concerned about." Sheriff Henderson nodded grimly. "Jake, we need to talk about some visitors who've been asking questions around town." Three men led by someone calling himself Frank Hawkins, claiming to be looking for a missing young lady on behalf of her worried family. "They were here this morning," Jake admitted, seemed more interested in searching than in providing help to someone in distress. "That's because they're not really concerned about Miss Wells's welfare," Sheriff Henderson said bluntly. "We've received some telegrams from colleagues in Dallas that paint a very different picture of the situation than the one these men have been describing." Emma went pale at the mention of telegrams from Dallas, clearly fearing that official law enforcement was about to side with Blackwood's version of events. Jake moved to stand beside her, offering silent support as they waited to hear what information the sheriff had discovered. "Turns out Richard Blackwood isn't quite the respectable businessman he pretends to be," Doc Patterson continued. "He's got a history of using intimidation and violence to resolve business disputes, and there are several women in Dallas who've made unofficial complaints about his treatment of them. The problem is that Blackwood's money and connections have kept him from facing any official consequences," Sheriff Henderson added. "But that doesn't mean local law enforcement has to cooperate with his attempts to extend his influence into our territory." The revelation that legitimate authorities were aware of Blackwood's true nature and opposed to his efforts came as an enormous relief to both Jake and Emma. They weren't facing this threat alone, and they wouldn't have to worry about local officials being corrupted or intimidated into supporting Blackwood's claims. "What exactly did you learn from Dallas?" Emma asked, her voice steady despite the fear Jake could see in her eyes. Sheriff Henderson consulted a piece of paper he withdrew from his vest pocket. "Enough to know that you're the victim here, not the perpetrator. Your disappearance was reported as a kidnapping initially, but the circumstances described didn't match the evidence at the scene. No signs of forced entry, no indication of struggle, personal items missing that suggested planned departure rather than abduction. More importantly," Doc Patterson added, "we learned about the financial arrangements that were supposed to be finalized through your marriage to Blackwood. The amounts involved are substantial enough to provide clear motivation for the kind of pressure that's been applied to your family." Emma nodded slowly, clearly relieved that the truth was finally being acknowledged by people in positions of authority. "So you understand that I wasn't kidnapped or coerced into leaving," she said. "I made a conscious choice to flee rather than submit to a marriage that would have been nothing more than legalized slavery." "We understand completely," Sheriff Henderson confirmed. "And we want you to know that you'll have the full protection of local law enforcement for as long as you're in our jurisdiction. Hawkins and his men may have some kind of authority in Dallas, but they have no legal standing here." The assurance of official protection removed one of Jake's major concerns about their situation. With local law enforcement actively supporting them, Blackwood's men would be forced to operate more carefully, unable to simply kidnap Emma and claim legal justification for their actions. "There's something else," Doc Patterson said, his expression growing more serious. "We've learned that Blackwood isn't planning to wait much longer for Hawkins to resolve this situation quietly. He's reportedly making arrangements to come to Texas himself, bringing additional men and resources to bear on the problem." The news that Blackwood was planning personal involvement in the search escalated the threat significantly. The man's presence would bring additional pressure on local officials and provide him with opportunities to use his wealth and influence in ways that might override the protection that Sheriff Henderson was offering. When Jake asked grimly, "Within the week according to our sources," Sheriff Henderson replied. "Which means we need to take steps to ensure Miss Wells's safety before he arrives with enough firepower to overwhelm local resistance." The conversation that followed focused on practical measures for protecting Emma and ensuring that Blackwood's arrival wouldn't result in a violent confrontation that could endanger innocent people. Jake's ranch provided good defensive terrain, but it was isolated enough that determined attackers could lay siege to it without immediate intervention from law enforcement. "The safest option might be to relocate Miss Wells to town temporarily," Doc Patterson suggested. "My house has good sight lines and is close enough to the sheriff's office that any attempt to take her would be immediately visible to multiple witnesses." Emma shook her head firmly. "I appreciate the offer, but I won't hide behind other people's protection while putting them at risk for my sake. Jake has offered me the security of marriage, and I intend to accept that protection while contributing whatever I can to our mutual defense." The determination in her voice impressed both visitors, and Jake felt a surge of pride at her courage and refusal to let others bear the full burden of protecting her. Emma wasn't just accepting his help, she was declaring her intention to stand beside him as an equal partner in facing whatever challenges lay ahead. "Then we'll make sure you're both as prepared as possible," Sheriff Henderson said approvingly. Jake's got good instincts and military experience, but some additional firepower and backup plans wouldn't hurt. The evening that had begun with declarations of love and plans for the future had ended with preparations for a siege, but Jake found himself more determined than ever to protect the woman he was coming to love and the partnership they were building together. Emma had proven herself to be exactly the kind of partner he'd hoped for: intelligent, courageous, and willing to fight for what they were creating together. As Doc Patterson and Sheriff Henderson prepared to leave, they made arrangements for regular communication and mutual support that would ensure Jake and Emma weren't facing their challenges alone. The community that Jake had been part of for 10 years was rallying to protect one of their own, and the woman he'd chosen to marry. "One more thing," Sheriff Henderson said as he prepared to mount his horse. "You two planning to make this marriage official anytime soon? Because a legal ceremony witnessed by respectable citizens would go a long way toward establishing Miss Wells's status and your right to protect her." Jake looked at Emma, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. They'd been planning to marry as a matter of practical necessity, but their feelings for each other had evolved far beyond mere convenience. A wedding ceremony would formalize not just their legal relationship but their emotional commitment to building a life together. "Tomorrow," Emma said decisively. "If Jake agrees, I'd like to be married tomorrow, properly and legally, with witnesses who can testify to the legitimacy of our union." "Tomorrow it is," Jake confirmed, taking her hand in his. "Doc, would you be willing to serve as one of our witnesses? And Sheriff, could you make sure the paperwork is properly filed and recorded?" Both men agreed readily, understanding the importance of establishing Emma's new legal status as quickly as possible. By tomorrow evening she would be Mrs. Jake Morrison, with all the legal protections that married status could provide, and the personal security of knowing that she was truly wanted and valued by the man she was choosing to spend her life with. As their visitors departed into the night, Jake and Emma stood together on the porch of the ranch house that would soon officially belong to both of them. The stars overhead seemed brighter than usual, and the familiar sounds of the night seemed like a symphony celebrating the beginning of their new life together. "Are you certain about this?" Jake asked softly, giving Emma one final opportunity to reconsider the enormous step they were about to take. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," Emma replied, leaning into his embrace. "Tomorrow I become your wife, and whatever challenges we face after that, we'll face them together as equal partners." The promise settled between them with the weight of absolute commitment, and Jake knew that regardless of what Richard Blackwood and his allies might bring against them, he and Emma would meet those challenges with the combined strength of two people who'd chosen each other freely and completely. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.